Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness could be gained through the law, Christ died for nothing. I want to talk to you for a few minutes about making life worth living. Making life worth living. Paul writes this epistle to the Galatians for both doctrinal and personal reasons. Doctrinally, he writes to correct false teaching that had seeped into the church. Judaizers, legalist Christians of Jewish background, were teaching that in order to be saved, one must submit to the Mosaic covenant and circumcision. They disparaged Paul's integrity, and they accused him of using the gospel for personal aggrandizement. And so beyond a doctrinal distinction, there was a personal reason for Paul writing. His call had come into question. His motives had been challenged. His sincerity had been doubted. And the thing that hurt Paul deeply was that the very people he had done the most for were now turning away from him. My brothers and sisters, if you've ever tried to help somebody, the one thing that you have to learn to expect along the way is that the one that you've done the most for may be the one that will break your heart. I've been pastoring people now for nearly 27 years. There have been many times that I've gone out of my way to help people. I've cut vacations short to come and help people. I've gotten off of my sick leave in order to help people. I've gone into jail, into prison to try to help people. I've gone to the hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning to try to help people. I've gone into troubled homes and put myself in harm's way trying to help people. I've gone into my pocket and spent the little money I had trying to help people. And I can testify today that it's a hurting thing to have people that you tried to help, people that you've gone out of your way to help, do their best to hurt you. It hurts your heart when folk have no appreciation for the good that you tried to do. But when I experience that, I'm reminded of what Paul tells us in this very epistle. Let us not become weary in doing good. For at the proper time, we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Paul was hurt by this church that he had done so much for. But to his credit, he doesn't let his hurt overrule his love. In love, he decided that he needed to write a letter of instruction to get them back on course. To be sure, Galatians is one of the most important, doctrinally sound epistles that Paul ever wrote. He fills this letter with sound teaching designed to correct the numerous errors of the Judaizers. But the matter that captures our attention today is not the doctrine alone, but how Paul applies this sound doctrine to his personal living. In the second chapter, Paul places himself under interrogation. And in so doing, he shares with the Galatians and with us what it is that makes his life worth living. He says to them in so many words, "You've challenged my sincerity, you've questioned my motives, you've scrutinized my intentions, you've said that I'm using the gospel for personal gain, and in effect, you've labeled me a hypocrite. And I'm not going to respond with equally ugly epithets, nor am I going to try to draw out your sympathy. But I would respond by affirming that the very thing that I have taught is the thing that I have employed in my daily living. I have been crucified with Christ. And I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. And I do not set aside the grace of God. For if righteousness could be gained through the law, and Christ died for nothing." Church, it's only when we can say that we have lived what we profess that we can affirm that the gospel makes life worth living. The most important response that we can give is not with our mouths, but with how we live. So let us consider what Paul says with his mouth and how it lines up with his living. First, Paul says, "I have been crucified with Christ." He does not simply say, "I have died with Christ." But he says, "I have been crucified with Christ." And that's significant because crucifixion involves not only death, but crucifixion involves suffering and humiliation. Let me assure you, there is nothing pleasant about suffering or humiliation. But the power of this statement is not crucified. It is crucified with Christ. Paul is telling us that the first thing that has made his life worth living is that Jesus has been his constant companion in his times of suffering. Church, there is a big difference between suffering for and suffering with. And yet, because Jesus does both, he makes life worth living. Oh, I know he suffered for us. I heard Isaiah say he was wounded for our transgression. He was bruised for our iniquity. I heard this same Paul say in 2 Corinthians 5:21, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. I even heard Jesus say it about himself when he said, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. But more than suffer for us, he also suffers with us. He's our companion in our suffering. I will be with you always, even to the end of the world. In his life, Paul had been through some rough times. He writes about it in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 when he says, I have worked much harder, been imprisoned more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Beside everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. Who is weak, Paul asks. And I do not feel weak. Who is led into sin, and I do not inwardly burn. But when he gets over to the 12th chapter, Paul reminds us that throughout his suffering, he was never alone. For he heard the voice of Jesus say to him, "My grace is sufficient for you." And so Paul concludes the matter by saying that Jesus is the one that makes life worth living. For Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses and in insults and in hardships and in persecutions and in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Church, when you know that Jesus didn't just suffer for you, but that he suffers with you, that he is our constant companion in our suffering, then we can know that he makes life worth living. Well, then Paul says that life is worth living because Christ lived in him. The indwelling of Christ is more than just a promise of companionship, but it is an assurance of empowerment. You see, where Jesus dwells, there is supernatural power. And supernatural power enables us to deal with things and cope with things that we could not deal with or cope with on our own. Jesus dwelling in Paul enabled Paul to love people who were doing their best to kill him. Jesus dwelling in Paul gave Paul the courage to forgive those who had wronged him in the past. Jesus dwelling in Paul buttressed Paul as he faced down demons and spoke truth to power. And what Jesus did for Paul, he'll also do for us. Paul says that the power of Jesus is what transforms us. He says, the life I now live in the body, I don't live in me. I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. And just like Paul, life for us becomes worth living when we come to realize that it's Jesus who transforms us. It is his indwelling that shifts our vision from one of personal fulfillment to one of wanting to please him. It is his indwelling that anchors us and holds us safe when the storms of life threaten to tear us apart. It is his indwelling that permits us to look for good in people who don't believe that we have any good in us. It is his indwelling that offers us perpetually renewed hope and optimism, even in the most negative of circumstances. It is his indwelling that gives us the strength to turn the other cheek and bless those who curse us. It is his indwelling that frees us from the burden of having to live up to somebody else's artificial standard of success. It is his indwelling, transforming, revisioning power that makes life worth living. Well, finally, Paul says that life is worth living when we live under his grace. Listen to what he says. He says, I do not set aside the grace of God. Because if righteousness could be gained through the law, then Christ died for nothing. Grace is God's unmerited favor. Grace is God choosing to love that which is utterly unlovable. Grace is God choosing to see us as something that we are not, so that he will not have to deal with us as we are. Grace is God choosing to look past our rebellion and reconciling us back to himself. Grace is God choosing not to look at us directly, but rather to look at us through the filter of the blood of Jesus Christ. Because it is his blood that covers us. It is his blood that cleanses us. It is his blood that reveals in us that which God intended for us to be. Paul says that grace is the only way that I could have made it. I couldn't achieve righteousness under the law. I don't measure up to the standard. But I'm glad that I don't have to measure up to the standard. Jesus bridges the gap between where I am and where I should be. Jesus changes my labor from an effort to achieve something to a thanksgiving for what he's already done. Jesus estranges me from my sin and unites me to his perfection. Jesus enfolds me in his love, which knows no limit nor restriction. Jesus lifts me out of the hell that I deserve and permanently places me in the category of the saved. And so I do not set aside grace. For grace is the only thing that helps me. Church, as I close this morning, I don't know about you, but I'm glad that Paul's answer is my answer. I'm glad that I've discovered what it is that truly makes life worth living. It's not worth living because of personal achievements. It's not the accolades of people, and it's certainly not worldly prosperity. But life becomes worth living when we decide to live for Jesus. The same Paul said in Philippians, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. This same Paul said, forgetting what is behind me, straining toward what is ahead, I press toward the mark of the high call of God in Christ Jesus. And so my prayer every day is, Lord, as I walk, let men see Christ in me. As I talk, let them hear Christ in my conversation. As I work, let my light so shine before me that they will see my good work and give glory to my Father in heaven. Let my living be for you. For it is only when we live for you that life becomes worth living.
Watch this.
Yours is God.